I cut the outboard and let the skiff drift. The water was black and still, reflecting nothing, and the air smelled like wet wood and rot. This was my 18th night survey in 3 weeks, and up until now they'd all been the same. Conductivity readings, GPS track logs, field notes in a waterproof notebook, methodical, routine. The kind of work that empties your head out. I'd been hired by the Army Corps of Engineers to catalog water chemistry and plant species across the lower Atchafalaya Basin. 6 weeks total, half of them already gone. The contract paid well and nobody bothered me, which was how I preferred it. Tonight's transect ran through a backwater slough my survey map marked as a dead-end drainage, accessible only through a narrow gap in the old-growth cypress stands. I'd idled the outboard down to almost nothing as I passed through the gap, and the canopy had closed overhead like a tunnel. No wind, no bird sound, just the smell of decomposing vegetation and standing water, and the low burble of the motor. The FLIR Scout thermal camera was mounted on the bow rail where I could see the display without leaning forward. I'd powered it on when I entered the slough and had been watching it while I worked, lowering the conductivity probe at marked intervals, reading the meter, logging the values, moving forward. Repetitive, familiar. The kind of task you can do without thinking. The FLIR picked up the heat source at 9:47. Large, dense, stationary, 20 meters off the port side, sitting in the water or just below the surface. The signature was consistent with a big alligator, which wasn't unusual. I'd seen dozens of them over the last 3 weeks, most of them smaller than this one, but a few that size or larger. They didn't move much at night unless you got close. I cut the motor. The skiff drifted in silence. I lifted my headlamp and swept the beam across the water's surface, tracking toward where the thermal was showing me the heat source. In the headlamp beam, I saw a man. He was standing chest deep in the slough, facing away from me, completely motionless. The water around his waist and legs was glowing, blue-white light pulsing in a tight ring, not diffuse like algae bloom or disturbed sediment, but structured. Lines of luminescence converging inward on his torso from every direction, like spokes on a wheel. I held the beam on him. He didn't move. The skiff drifted silently toward the far bank, carried by momentum and the faint current running through the slough. The water was completely quiet. No ripples, no sound. Just the man standing in the black water, surrounded by that pulsing blue-white ring, and the dark cypress pressing in on all sides. I kept the headlamp beam on him and waited. I called out to him, "Can you hear me?" Nothing. The man stood in the water without moving, his back to me, the blue-white light pulsing around his waist in that tight, structured ring. I let 5 seconds pass, then 10. He turned. The movement was slow, deliberate, like someone waking from sleep. His face came into the beam of my headlamp, and I saw it clearly. Where his eyes should have been, there was nothing. Just smooth, pale scar tissue, not damaged, not fresh. The sockets had closed over completely, sealed from the inside, as if the skin had grown inward and fused shut. His lips were moving without sound, forming words I couldn't hear. I lifted the field camera and hit record. The bioluminescence around him wasn't diffuse like algae bloom or disturbed sediment. It was structured. Lines of light in the water, converging inward on his torso from every direction, radiating out in equal spacing like spokes on a wheel, precise as a printed grid. I held the camera steady and counted 10 seconds, then 20. The man took 1 step toward the skiff. Then his knees folded and he sat down into the water, sinking below the surface without a sound. The light cut off instantly. The slough went completely dark. I killed the headlamp and waited, listening. The water was silent. No splashing, no movement. Just the faint rustle of wind through the cypress canopy overhead. I counted 60 seconds in my head, slow and deliberate, the way I'd been trained to do when making field observations. When I reached 60, I switched the headlamp back on and poled toward where he'd gone under. The man surfaced 2 meters from the hull. He came up face first, breathing normally, his sealed sockets pointed at the sky. He didn't thrash, didn't panic, just floated there on his back, arms at his sides, completely still. I brought the skiff alongside him and reached down, hooking my hands under his armpits. He didn't resist, didn't help either. I hauled him over the gunwale and he sat where I placed him, hands flat on his thighs, his face angled slightly upward. "Can you tell me your name?" "Nothing." "Do you know where you are?" "Nothing." His sealed sockets were dry, his breathing was steady. He looked calm. I picked up the radio and called the Coast Guard station at Morgan City, gave them my GPS coordinates, and told them I had a man in the skiff who needed medical attention. The dispatcher asked if he was injured. I said I didn't know how to answer that. They said they'd send a shallow draft vessel and to stay where I was. The man didn't move for the entire 40 minutes it took them to arrive. He sat with his hands on his thighs and his face pointed at the sky, and the only sound he made was his breathing. When the Coast Guard vessel pulled alongside, 2 men in orange vests helped him aboard without asking many questions. One of them asked me if I knew him. I said no. They asked if he'd said anything. I said no. They told me to follow them back to the boat launch at Butte La Rose. I followed by skiff, running the outboard at half throttle, watching the Coast Guard vessel's stern light disappear and reappear through the gaps in the cypress stands. By the time we reached the launch, it was nearly 11 o'clock. I loaded my gear into the truck and drove straight to Tesh Regional Medical Center in Morgan City. The Coast Guard had already brought him in by the time I arrived. I found him in the emergency department, sitting upright on an exam table, still silent, still calm. The physician was a woman in her early 40s, dark skin, close-cropped hair, wearing scrubs and a white coat. Her name tag said Lucy Kelly. She looked up when I walked in. "You the one who found him?" "Yes." "Can you tell me what happened?" I gave her the short version. I was running a survey in the basin. I saw him standing in the water. I pulled him out and called the Coast Guard. She looked at me for a moment, then nodded and went back to examining him. I watched her check his vitals, his pupils, or what should have been his pupils, his reflexes. She shone a penlight at the sealed tissue where his eyes had been and moved it side to side, watching for a response. There wasn't one. After a few minutes, she stepped back and looked at me. "Both eye sockets are sealed with mature, well-healed scar tissue," she said. "The closure is months old at minimum, possibly longer. Otherwise, he's in good physical health. No dehydration, no exposure, no wounds. There's nothing medically urgent here. He's in better condition than most people who walk in off the street." "He won't talk," I said. "I noticed." "Do you know who he is?" "No identification. We ran him through the missing persons database. Nothing. He won't give his name or respond to any question." She wrote something on a clipboard, then looked back at me. "I'm admitting him for observation. There's nothing more I can do tonight." I thanked her and left. In the hospital parking lot, I sat in my truck with the engine off and the windows down, the night air warm and thick with the smell of cut grass and diesel exhaust. I pulled the field camera from my kit and connected it to my tablet, uploading the footage I'd recorded in the slough. The video started with the man's back, the blue-white light pulsing around his waist, then the slow turn, the sealed sockets, the moving lips. I scrubbed through the frames, watching the light in the water around him. That was when I saw it clearly. The bioluminescent pattern wasn't random. It formed a precise radial grid, lines of equal spacing converging inward on the man's torso from every direction, like a coordinate overlay, like a GPS grid projected in light onto the water's surface. I paused the video and stared at it. Then I opened the GPS track log on my tablet and pulled up the Corps of Engineers survey dataset for the lower Atchafalaya. I cross-referenced my position from the night. latitude and longitude, locked in at the moment I'd cut the motor and drifted toward the man. The backwater slough where I'd found him wasn't on the map. I zoomed in, zoomed out, checked the dataset version, checked the date. The slough wasn't there. The entire reach was absent from the active survey map, as if it had been deliberately excluded from the grid. I sat in the truck with the tablet on my lap, the screen showing the blank space where the slough should have been. The field camera footage was paused on the frame of the radial bioluminescent grid converging on the motionless man. I didn't move for a long time. I waited until morning to make the call. Edith Cortez didn't answer office hours calls before 8, and I wanted her at her desk when I told her what I'd found. The field camp trailer was quiet. I'd made coffee on the propane burner and sat with my tablet open to the GPS track log, the blank space on the core data set where the slough should have been. The coordinates were accurate. I'd checked them 3 times. At 8:02, I dialed her direct line. She picked up on the 3rd ring. "Cooper," she said, "you're up early." "I need to report an unmapped backwater," I said. 4 miles east of the main channel, accessible through a gap in the cypress stands. It's not in the active survey dataset. Silence. I waited. The line was still live. I could hear the faint hum of her office air conditioning, but she didn't speak. "Edith?" "Give me the coordinates," she said. I read them off the tablet screen. She didn't respond. I heard the soft click of her typing, then a pause that stretched long enough I thought the call had dropped. "Edith, are you—" "A survey crew flagged that reach of the basin in 2019 for navigational anomalies," she said. Her voice was flat, careful. "The district office subsequently removed it from the active map." I set the coffee cup down. "Why?" "I can't say more than that on the phone. Don't push this up the chain until I've had a chance to look at the file." "What file?" But she'd already hung up. I sat there with the phone in my hand, staring at the blank space on the map. A survey crew had flagged it for navigational anomalies, and the district office had buried it. I thought about the man in the water, the bioluminescent grid converging on his body, the sealed eye sockets, the way he'd sat down into the black water and surfaced 2 meters from the hull without panic, without sound. Navigational anomalies. I closed the tablet and finished the coffee. The boat landing at Butte La Rose was busy by the time I arrived. Fishermen unloading gear, a few tourists with rental kayaks, a parish maintenance crew working on the dock pilings. I parked the truck and walked the length of the launch, looking for someone who'd talk. The first 2 men I asked were polite and unhelpful. One of them suggested I try the charter services out of Morgan City. The other one just shook his head and went back to loading his cooler. I was about to give up when a man fueling a flatboat at the far end of the dock paused, looked at me and said, "You want Xavier Lopez. He's got a dock behind the launch. Don't tell him I sent you." He turned back to the fuel line before I could ask why. I found the dock 10 minutes later, tucked behind a stand of willows where the access road dead-ended. It wasn't marked. There was a single skiff tied up, aluminum hull, shallow draft, rigged for serious water. Depth finder mounted on the console, live well, a rod rack that currently held no rods. A man was kneeling on the dock working on an outboard motor with a socket wrench. He didn't look up when I approached. "Xavier Lopez?" I asked. "That's right." He set the wrench down and stood. He was broad-shouldered, weathered, with pale green eyes and sun-bleached brown hair going gray at the temples. His hands were thick and scarred. He looked at me the way you'd look at a stranger who'd walked into your yard uninvited. "I need a guide," I said. "Someone who knows the back sloughs east of the main channel." "Plenty of guides in Morgan City." "I need someone who knows the unmapped reach 4 miles out." His expression didn't change, but something shifted in the way he was standing. He picked up a rag and wiped his hands slowly, methodically. not looking at me. "What for?" he asked. "Water samples. I have GPS coordinates for a backwater that isn't on any core map. I need to get in there and run a few tests." He folded the rag and set it on the dock rail. "When?" "Tomorrow morning." He didn't answer right away. He looked past me, out toward the main channel, then down at the skiff. His silence wasn't the silence of someone thinking it over. It was the silence of someone who already knew enough not to want more. "I'll take you," he said finally. "Be here at 6. "What's your rate?" "200 for the day, cash." I nodded. He picked up the socket wrench and went back to the motor without another word. I drove away from the Butte La Rose dock with Xavier's agreement for the next morning, the guide's near-total silence about the unmapped Slav sitting heavier than any question he could have asked. Xavier showed up at the dock just after 6, the sky still gray. He parked his truck and walked to the skiff carrying a rifle case. I watched him open the case and pull out a bolt-action 30-06. He checked the chamber, set the safety, and laid it flat in the bottom of the skiff without saying a word about why he'd brought it. I didn't ask. We ran the main channel east for 40 minutes, the water flat and the air cool, then turned north into a series of narrowing sloughs that twisted through the cypress stands. The trees closed over us gradually, getting thicker and taller the deeper we went, until the canopy overhead was solid enough to block most of the sky. The light turned green and dim, and the GPS signal on my handheld started flickering, dropping out for 10-second stretches and leaving gaps in the track log. Xavier slowed the motor but didn't stop. He knew this water. The unmapped backwater opened ahead without warning, the channel widening into a broad, still pool that stretched 100 yards in every direction. The water was black, not brown, and the cypress knees rose from the surface in rows that looked almost deliberate, like someone had planted them. There was no wind, no bird sound. The air smelled like rot and standing water, thick enough to taste. Xavier killed the motor and let the skiff drift. I pulled my sample kit and ran conductivity first, then salinity, then a field bioluminescence assay on the silt I scooped from just below the surface. The organism density came back 40 times higher than anywhere else I'd surveyed in 6 weeks. The sediment wasn't just hosting the bioluminescent cells. It was saturated with them. I ran the assay again to make sure I hadn't contaminated the sample. Same result. Xavier pointed toward the bank without speaking. I followed his hand and saw them below the water line, caught in the exposed cypress roots along the edge. 6 human eyes, intact, undamaged, arranged in a loose cluster, each one still faintly glowing at the pupil with that same cold blue-white light I'd seen around the man in the water 2 nights ago. They weren't decomposing. The water had preserved them. I used the net pole to lift them out one at a time. They were cold, slick, heavier than I expected. The arrangement wasn't random. Someone had placed them there, deliberately, in a pattern that looked like it meant something. I bagged 2 as samples, photographed the rest where they sat in the roots, and logged the GPS coordinates. My hands were steady. Xavier's face was not. Neither of us spoke for a minute. I stowed the sample kit and checked the time. It was later than I thought. The canopy had hidden how fast the light was dropping, and by the time I looked up again, the slough was in full shadow, the last gray glow of dusk sinking behind the trees. The bioluminescence activated as the light went. It started as pinpoints beneath the surface, scattered across the silt, then spread in a single slow pulse that covered the entire floor of the backwater, a vast grid of blue-white light extending in every direction beneath the black water, visible through the surface like a lit map of the basin below. The lines were evenly spaced, radial, converging on points I couldn't see. It was the same pattern I'd recorded on the field camera 2 nights ago, but this time it covered everything. Xavier leaned forward, staring at the water. A great blue heron landed on a cypress branch directly above the skiff. The pulse beneath the branch changed immediately. The grid lines accelerated, converging on the branch from multiple directions, tightening into a bright knot of light. The heron tipped forward and fell. It didn't flap, didn't cry out. It just entered the water without a sound. The bioluminescence flared brilliant white around the point where it went in. The light held for 3 seconds, so bright I had to look away, then dropped cold. I grabbed the pole and pushed the skiff toward the spot. The heron surfaced a moment later and floated face down, chest rising and falling, alive and breathing. Its eye sockets were sealed smooth. The same pale scar tissue, the same clean closure, no blood, no wound, just gone. I lifted my headlamp and looked at the heron's face. The tissue was mature, healed, like it had been that way for weeks, but I had just watched it happen in under 3 seconds. I understood what I was looking at then. The organism wasn't passive. It wasn't a microbe blooming in the sediment or some accidental contamination event. It was an active, selective collector of optic nerves, and it had just demonstrated that on a living animal in the dark without physical contact. The man from the hospital wasn't a victim. He was a participant. I pulled the thermal camera from my pack and scanned the far end of the slough. The screen lit up with a structure at the water's edge, low and wide, built from old cypress logs blackened with age and lashed together with cordage. The center section was flat and raised, roughly the size of a dining table. Around the platform, visible on the thermal as a ring of stationary heat signatures, were 12 or 13 people standing in the shallows, completely still, facing inward toward the platform. I held the camera on them for a long moment, then lowered it and told Xavier what the screen was showing. He didn't look at the camera. He looked at the water. "I heard stories about the Holmes family," he said quietly. "People who live on unregistered land deep in the basin. Been here for generations. Nobody from Morgan City goes looking for them." I looked at Xavier. He didn't look back. He picked up the rifle and held it across his knees. I poled toward the platform. The water was still and black and made no sound under the hull. The bioluminescent grid pulsed beneath us in slow waves, lighting the cypress roots along the waterline. And I could see the platform clearly now. Old cypress logs lashed together with cordage that looked like it had been there for decades. The center section was flat and raised, big enough for 3 or 4 people to lie down. A tall man stepped to the water's edge and waited. He didn't move. He just stood there, hands loose at his sides, watching us approach. When we were close enough that I could see his face, he spoke. "You're not trespassing exactly," he said. His voice was low and slow, unhurried. "But you've come further than most people do. You're welcome to leave the same way you arrived." I set the pole down and let the skiff drift the last few feet. "The man from the hospital," I said. "The one I pulled from the water. I need to know who he is." The tall man nodded once. "His name is Tim. He gave his eyes willingly. He'll be returning to the basin soon." I looked at his eyes. They were intact. Both of them. But the irises carried a faint blue-white film, the same cold luminescence as the grid in the water. It wasn't reflected light. It was coming from behind them, as if something inside his skull was glowing. "I'm Donnie," he said. "You can come up on the platform if you want. I'll show you what the exchange is." He said it the way someone offers a cup of coffee. No pressure, no urgency, just an invitation he'd clearly made before. I stepped onto the platform. Xavier followed, the rifle still in his hands. There was a young man lying on his back on the center section. He was awake. His eyes were open and looking straight up at the canopy, and his hands were flat at his sides. His expression was calm, deliberate, like he'd been waiting for this. Around the platform, standing in the shallows, were 12 or 13 people, all of them blind, all of them with sealed sockets, all of them facing inward toward the young man. The bioluminescent grid in the water converged on the platform from every direction. I could see it through the surface, lines of light drawing inward in slow pulses. "The organism in the water isn't a microbe," Donnie said quietly. "It's the peripheral nervous system of something much older, something that's been living in the basin's deep sediment longer than the cypress trees, possibly longer than the delta itself." I didn't say anything. I just watched the grid pulse. "It perceives the world through bioluminescent signal," Donnie continued. "Years ago, it started offering a trade. It shares its perception, a vast, 360-degree awareness of every living thing moving through the basin, in exchange for human optic nerves. The nerves carry a different kind of signal, richer. The organism processes them as a new way of seeing." He gestured toward the people standing in the water. "They chose it, all of them." The exchange began. I watched as the young man's eyes filmed over. It took 4 minutes. The blue-white glow spread across the surface of each eye like frost forming on glass, and then the sockets went smooth. The scar tissue formed as I watched, pale, seamless, sealed. The young man sat up. He turned his sealed face toward me. "I can see you," he said. His expression was one of complete peace. Not performance, not pretending, just peace. I raised my field camera and took 3 photographs: the platform, the people in the water, the young man. The bioluminescent grid fired. Every cell in the basin ignited at once. The whole slough went blue-white, brighter than daylight, and I couldn't see anything except light. Xavier raised the rifle, but there was nothing to point it at. The grid lines in the water were converging on us from all directions. "Be still," Donnie said sharply. "Both of you. The organism is reading you. Movement intensifies the response." I froze. Xavier froze. I felt a pressure at the back of my eyes. Not painful, just there, like something pressing gently from the inside. "I think I'm going blind," Xavier said. His voice was flat, factual. Donnie stepped forward and took the rifle from Xavier's hands. Xavier didn't resist. "You'll need to stay until morning," Donnie said. He set the rifle against the platform railing. The bioluminescent grid was still pulsing beneath the black water in every direction around the platform. Donnie built a fire on the platform. He didn't ask if we wanted one. He just pulled a bundle of dry wood from beneath a tarp near the railing and got it started with a striker and some shredded bark. The flames caught fast, and the orange light pushed back against the dark water around us. I sat with my back against one of the support beams. Xavier sat across from me, hands on his knees, not looking at anything in particular. The pressure behind my eyes had settled into a dull ache, like the beginning of a migraine that never quite arrived. Donnie crouched by the fire and didn't speak for a while. The blind elders were still standing in the shallows around the platform, facing inward, their sealed eyes reflecting nothing. The young man who had given his eyes sat near the center of the platform with his legs crossed, his hands resting palm up on his thighs. He looked calm, not like someone who had just lost their sight, more like someone who had been waiting for this to happen and was relieved it was finally done. "The voluntary exchange produces genuine expanded perception," Donnie said eventually. His voice was low and even, the way someone explains something they've explained many times before. "The people who give their eyes willingly navigate the basin without error. They're aware of everything moving through the water for miles. Every fish, every alligator, every heron. The organism shares its perception with them. It's not a metaphor. It's not symbolic. They see through the water itself." Xavier looked up at him but didn't say anything. "What you just received," Donnie continued, "is different. You were exposed involuntarily. The organism read you because you were close enough and warm enough and the conditions were right. That kind of exposure is painful. It's degenerative. It will eventually blind you, and it's always one-sided. You don't gain anything from it, only the cost. I felt the ache behind my eyes sharpen for a moment, then fade. "How long?" I asked. Donnie shook his head. "I don't know. Months. Maybe longer. It depends on how deep the reed went." He looked at me directly, his filmed eyes catching the firelight. "You can take your photographs and your data and leave," he said. "The Corps of Engineers will eventually send someone who will dredge this basin and kill the entity. When the organism dies, it will trigger a terminal pulse that will blind every warm-blooded creature within a mile of the water. Every bird, every deer, every person, everything." He paused. "Or you can understand what you're holding and decide carefully what you do with it." He didn't tell me what the right decision was. He just sat there, waiting. I thought about the eyes I'd found in the cypress roots earlier that day. The ones I'd bagged and photographed. The ones that were still in my sample kit in the skiff. I thought about the heron that had gone into the water and come up blind. I thought about Tim, the man I'd pulled from the slough 3 nights ago, standing chest deep in the black water with his sealed face turned toward me. I didn't know what to say. One of the blind elders standing in the shallows turned and walked out into open water. He didn't say anything. He just walked until the water was up to his chest, and then he sank below the surface without a sound. Donnie went still. He chose to complete the exchange through full immersion, Donnie said quietly. Full dissolution. The optic nerves delivered directly. It sometimes causes the entity to spike unpredictably. The grid beneath the water began to pulse faster. The blue-white lines converged on the spot where the elder had gone under, drawing inward from every direction. And then the grid fired. Every bioluminescent cell in the basin ignited simultaneously. The slough became blue-white and total, brighter than daylight, with no shadow anywhere. The light was so bright I couldn't see the platform or the fire or Xavier or anything except the white sheet of it pressing against my eyes. I felt the pressure behind my eyes become something else. Not painful, just absolute. Like something inside my skull had opened all the way and let the light in. I pressed both palms over my eyes and dropped to the platform boards. I could hear Xavier shouting somewhere to my left, but I couldn't make out the words. The light held. It didn't pulse. It just stayed, bright and cold and total, for what felt like forever. And then it dropped. I took my hands away from my eyes slowly, expecting the worst. I could see, but the edges of my vision were bordered by a faint, constant bioluminescent glow. The grid was burned into my peripheral vision, showing me in cold blue-white the outline of every warm body within 30 feet. Xavier, still on his knees near the fire. Donnie standing by the railing, the young man who had given his eyes, sitting cross-legged and still. The blind elders returning to the shallows, their sealed faces turned toward the platform. I could see all of them, not with my eyes, with something else. Xavier was intact but shaken. The glow at the edge of his vision was faint but present. I could tell because he kept blinking and turning his head, trying to make it go away. He didn't speak. Donnie stepped forward and picked up the rifle. He handed it to me without a word. Then he walked both of us to the skiff and held the bow steady while Xavier climbed in first, then me. He didn't ask us to stay. He didn't ask us to promise anything. As I stepped into the skiff, Donnie said only, "You know what the water is now. That's already a different kind of knowing." I picked up the pole and pushed off from the platform. Xavier sat in the bow with his back to me, his hands gripping the gunwales. Neither of us spoke. I pulled the skiff out of the slough slowly, keeping to the center of the channel where the cypress knees were spaced wide enough to pass through. The grid beneath the water pulsed slow and steady, lighting the black surface from below. When we were far enough out that the platform was just a dark shape against the trees, I looked back. Donnie stood at the water's edge, watching us go. His filmed eyes were faintly luminescent in the dark. The bioluminescent grid pulsed slow and steady beneath the black water around the platform, the blue-white lines converging on the spot where the elder had gone under and never surfaced. I stood in the bow and pulled us through the dark water, keeping the skiff moving slow and steady. Xavier sat ahead of me with his back turned, his hands gripping the gunnels. Neither of us spoke. The grid beneath the water pulsed slow and steady, lighting the black surface from below. I kept my eyes on the channel ahead, steering us between the cypress knees where the passage was wide enough to slip through without catching the hull. Somewhere off the port side, maybe 15 feet down, something rolled under the surface. I felt it before I saw the grid flare beneath it. A gar, long and heavy, turning in the current. The pressure arrived at the edge of my mind like a weight I couldn't shake. I knew exactly where the fish was, how fast it was moving, the shape of its body cutting through the water. I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the pole, on the rhythm of pushing us forward. But the pressure didn't stop. It settled in and stayed there, constant and quiet, feeding me information I hadn't asked for. A turtle moved off the bottom to starboard, its shell scraping against the silt. I felt that too. The grid beneath it flared blue-white, and I knew the exact distance, 20 feet, maybe a little more, and the direction it was crawling. Up ahead, something large and slow drifted in the center of the channel. An alligator, probably. The grid pulsed beneath it in a slow, steady rhythm, the lines converging on the body from every direction. I adjusted our course without thinking, steering us wide to give it room. Xavier didn't turn around, didn't say a word. I kept poling. The canopy began to open up as we moved further from the slough. The sky above us was still dark, but the trees were spaced wider now, and the GPS signal on my phone flickered back to life. We were close to the main channel. Xavier finally spoke. "I'm going to sell the boat," he said. His voice was flat, all the texture stripped out of it. "I'm not coming back out here." He said it once, quietly, and then went silent again. I didn't try to argue with him. There wasn't anything to say that would change what we both knew now. The grid at the edge of my vision pulsed faint and steady, and I was aware of every living thing in the water around us, their positions mapped out in my mind like coordinates on a chart. We reached the main channel and I steered us south toward Butte La Rose. The water opened up wide and black, the current running smooth beneath the hull. The grid was still there beneath the surface, but it was thinner here, the lines spaced further apart. The organism didn't cover the whole basin, just the backwaters, just the places where the silt was deep and the water didn't move. The boat launch came into view maybe 30 minutes later. Xavier stood up before I brought the skiff alongside the dock, and he tied us off without looking at me. He stepped onto the planks, walked to his truck, and climbed inside. I watched him go. The engine started, the headlights swept across the empty gravel lot, and then he was gone. I stood there for a long time, the skiff rocking gently against the dock. The grid pulsed at the edge of my vision, faint but constant, showing me the outline of the pilings beneath the water and the fish moving through the shallows near the bank. I loaded my gear into the truck bed, tied down the tarp, and drove back to camp. The road was empty. The headlights cut through the dark, and I kept both hands on the wheel, my eyes on the white line running down the center of the asphalt. The grid pulsed at the edge of my vision every 8 seconds, steady as a metronome. I could still feel the weight of everything moving in the water behind me, the pressure at the back of my mind like a signal I couldn't shut off. The field camp was dark when I pulled in. I killed the engine and sat in the cab for a while, listening to the ticking of the cooling metal and the sound of crickets in the tall grass along the fence line. Finally, I got out and walked to the trailer. The door was unlocked. I flipped the light switch and the overhead fluorescent buzzed to life, casting everything in cold white. I dropped my bag on the floor and walked to the bathroom. The mirror above the sink was streaked with dust and water spots. I turned on the tap and splashed cold water on my face, then looked up at my reflection. The grid was still there at the edges of my vision. Faint blue-white lines pulsing slow and steady, running along the periphery like a border I couldn't blink away. The interval was constant. 8 seconds. Pulse. 8 seconds. Pulse. I leaned closer to the mirror, turning my head slightly to one side. The grid moved with me, always at the edge, never quite in focus. And in the reflection I could see the outline of my own face rendered in cold light. The warm shape of my head and shoulders mapped out in blue-white at the edges, the way the organism saw me. I stood there and watched it pulse. 8 seconds. 8 seconds. 8 seconds. It didn't stop. I woke up with the grid still there. The blue-white lines pulsed steady at the edge of my vision, mapping everything warm in the trailer. My own hands. The heat signature of a small animal moving somewhere beneath the floorboards. The 8-second interval was unchanged. I made coffee and sat at the fold-out table with my laptop and the waterproof notebook I used for field notes. The core report was due by noon. I had the data from 17 sites across the lower Atchafalaya, all of it clean and complete. The conductivity readings, the plant species lists, the GPS track logs, everything ready to file, except for 3 sample points. I opened the report template and began transferring the numbers. Site 1 through Site 14 went in without changes. The data was good. The readings made sense. At Site 15, I skipped ahead to Site 16, then 17, and closed the file. The unmapped backwater wasn't in the dataset. The 3 water samples I'd pulled from the slough weren't in the report. The GPS track log for that reach wasn't attached. I read through the whole thing one more time to make sure it held together. It did. The gap was invisible. There was no reason for anyone in the New Orleans district office to notice that a backwater which didn't appear on their survey map also didn't appear in my data. I sent the report and closed the email window. Then I opened the core survey database and entered the GPS coordinates of the slough. The interface asked me to classify the hazard type. I selected submerged debris and typed a single line in the notes field. Recommend against survey activity in this reach. Navigational obstruction present, exact position variable with water level. The notation went into the system and flagged the coordinates in red, the kind of mark that stays in the file and doesn't get questioned. I logged out. The coffee had gone cold. I poured it out in the sink and stood there looking at the stained basin for a while, not thinking about anything in particular. The grid pulsed. 8 seconds. 8 seconds. When the sun went down, I sat back at the table and opened my field journal. The notebook was half full of survey notes, all of it written in the same careful block print I'd been using since graduate school. I turned to the first blank page and started writing. I wrote about the man in the water, the way the bioluminescence had ringed his body in a radial grid, lines converging inward from every direction, and the way his face had been sealed smooth where his eyes should have been. I wrote about pulling him into the skiff and the way he had sat without speaking, hands flat on his thighs, breathing normally. I wrote about the eyes and the cypress roots, 6 of them, intact and undamaged, still faintly luminescent at the pupils, arranged too carefully to be accidental. I wrote about the heron, the way it had tipped forward off the branch and entered the water without a sound, and the way the light had flared around it and gone cold, and the way it had surfaced with its eye sockets sealed, alive and breathing and blind. I wrote about the platform, the people standing in the shallows around it, all of them eyeless, all of them facing inward, the young man lying on the center section, calm and awake, and the way the grid had drawn toward him in slow pulses, the way his eyes had filmed over blue-white and then gone smooth, the scar tissue forming while I watched. I wrote what Donnie had said, that the organism in the water wasn't a microbe, but the peripheral nervous system of something older than the delta, that it had been offering a trade for years, expanded perception in exchange for human optic nerves, that the people who took the trade could navigate the basin without error, aware of everything moving through the water for miles. I wrote what the involuntary exposure had cost, the pressure behind my eyes, the way the terminal pulse had burned the grid into my peripheral vision, permanent and not switching off, the way Xavier had said he was going blind in a flat, empty voice, and the way he'd told me he was selling his boat and never coming back. I wrote about Donnie's two options: take the data and the photographs and file the report, and the Corps would dredge the basin and kill the entity, and the organism would trigger a pulse that would blind every warm-blooded creature within a mile of the water, or understand what I was holding and decide carefully what I did with it. I wrote for 3 pages and then stopped. My handwriting was still steady. The grid pulsed at the edge of my vision, mapping the warm outline of my own hand moving across the paper. I closed the journal and opened my laptop. The forum I used for field observations had a section for unusual environmental phenomena. I'd posted there before, once about an algae bloom in a Texas reservoir, and once about a coordinated bioluminescent plankton event off the Carolina coast. It was mostly biologists and environmental scientists, people who documented things that didn't fit the usual models. I started typing. I described the man in the water, the sealed eye sockets, the bioluminescent grid. I described the eyes in the cypress roots and the heron that went into the water and came out blind. I described the platform and the exchange and what Donnie had told me about the organism and the trade. I included everything I'd written in the field journal, except the name of the basin and the GPS coordinates of the slough. When I got to the end, I stopped and read it over. It sounded clinical, factual, like a field report with the location data stripped out. I thought about adding more, some kind of context or explanation, but there wasn't anything else to say. The data was the data. I added one more paragraph. If you're working near bioluminescent water, anywhere, not just the Gulf Coast, and the light activates in a pattern rather than randomly, you need to know what that means. If it moves toward you in lines, not clouds, it's not algae and it's not plankton. If it pulses at regular intervals, if it forms a grid, get out of the water. Don't stop to look at it. Don't photograph it. Just go. I read the whole post one more time, then I hit submit. The post went live. The timestamp appeared at the top. October 17th, 2024, 9:43 p.m. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark trailer, listening to the sounds of the camp around me. The hum of the propane fridge, the creak of the aluminum frame settling, the faint rustle of something moving through the grass outside. The grid pulsed once in my peripheral vision, blue-white lines, steady and cold, mapping the warm shape of my own body in the chair. 8 seconds, then again. 8 seconds. It didn't stop.